Jessica had always been the practical one in her family. While her friends spent their 20s traveling and dining out at fancy restaurants, she was the one bringing lunch to work in a worn lunchbox and skipping weekend trips to save money. It wasn't that she didn't want to enjoy life, but she had a dream that burned brighter than any vacation or designer handbag could satisfy. She wanted a place to call her own. As an elementary school teacher in Portland, Oregon, her salary was modest at best. Every month she looked at her bank account and did the math. After rent, utilities, groceries, and her beat-up Honda's constant repairs, there wasn't much left over. But whatever remained, even if it was just $50 or $60, went straight into her savings account. No exceptions. Her friends thought she was crazy. Her sister told her she was wasting her youth. But Jessica kept her eyes on the prize. By the time she turned 34 in early 2019, she had managed to save $40,000. It had taken her nearly 12 years of relentless discipline, countless sacrifices, and more ramen dinners than she cared to remember. She knew it wasn't much in the crazy housing market of Portland, where even run-down properties were being snatched up for ridiculous prices. But she also knew she had to start somewhere. She couldn't keep throwing money away on rent forever. That's when she met Linda, a real estate agent who had a reputation for working with first-time buyers on tight budgets. Linda didn't laugh at Jessica's modest savings or try to discourage her. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. They spent weeks looking at properties that were, to put it kindly, less than ideal. There was the house with the caved-in roof, the one that smelled like something had died in the walls, the charming cottage that turned out to be built on a flood zone. Each viewing was more discouraging than the last. Then, on a rainy Saturday in April, Linda's phone rang. She listened for a moment, scribbled something down, and looked at Jessica with cautious optimism. There was a new listing in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The house had been on the market for 4 months with no offers. The price had just been dropped to $180,000. Linda warned her not to get too excited because there had to be a reason it wasn't selling. But they scheduled a viewing for that afternoon anyway. When they pulled up to the address, Jessica understood why other buyers had passed. The small bungalow looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. The front yard was a jungle of overgrown grass and weeds that reached past her knees. The white paint on the exterior walls was peeling so badly that patches of bare wood showed through. Several shingles were missing from the roof, and the front porch sagged slightly to one side, giving the whole house a tired, crooked appearance. The windows were grimy, making it impossible to see inside, and the mailbox hung at an odd angle, barely attached to its post. Linda glanced at Jessica with an apologetic look, clearly ready to drive away if she said the word. But Jessica surprised herself. Instead of feeling discouraged, she felt something else entirely. Curiosity, maybe, or perhaps it was just stubbornness after months of disappointment. She got out of the car and walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door. Inside, the house smelled musty and old, like it had been closed up for a very long time. The wallpaper in the living room was a faded floral pattern from what must have been the 1970s, peeling at the corners. The carpet was worn and stained. The kitchen appliances looked like antiques and not the valuable kind. But as Jessica walked through the rooms, she noticed something important. The bones of the house were solid. The floors didn't creak too badly. The walls were straight. The rooms had good natural light even through the dirty windows. And there was a basement, which meant extra storage space. Linda pulled out the listing information and filled Jessica in on the details. The house had belonged to an elderly woman named Eleanor Hartwell, who had lived there alone for over 50 years. Mrs. Hartwell had passed away 6 months ago at the age of 92. She had no children, and her only living relatives were 2 nephews who lived on the East Coast. They had never been close to their aunt and had no interest in keeping the property. They just wanted to sell it quickly and split whatever money they could get. The nephews had hired an estate sale company to clear out most of the furniture and belongings, keeping only a few family heirlooms for themselves. They had listed the house as is, meaning they weren't going to make any repairs or improvements before selling. Most buyers had taken one look at the amount of work needed and moved on to easier properties. But for Jessica, the as-is condition was actually a blessing. It was the only reason the house was even remotely within her budget. That night, Jessica barely slept. She lay in her cramped studio apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about that little house. Yes, it needed work. A lot of work. But she was handy with basic repairs, and she had friends who could help with the bigger projects. The location was decent in a quiet neighborhood with good schools nearby, which would matter if she ever decided to sell. And most importantly, it was hers for the taking if she wanted it. The next morning, she called Linda and made an offer. $175,000, which was every penny she had saved plus what she could borrow for a down payment and closing costs. She held her breath for 2 agonizing days, wondering if the nephews would reject her offer or if another buyer would swoop in with something better. But Linda called on Tuesday evening with the news. The nephews had accepted. They were just relieved to have someone willing to take the property off their hands. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, inspections, and bank appointments. Jessica had to provide what felt like 1,000 documents proving her income, her savings, her employment history, and probably her entire life story. The home inspection revealed issues with the plumbing and electrical work that would need attention eventually, but nothing immediately dangerous. The bank approved her mortgage, though the interest rate made her wince. Still, she was going to be a homeowner. On the 1st of June 2019, Jessica sat in a title company office and signed more papers than she had ever seen in her life. Her hand cramped from writing her signature so many times. When it was finally done, the title officer handed her a set of keys with a smile and said congratulations. Jessica walked out of that office in a daze, clutching those keys like they were made of gold. That evening, she drove to her new house and parked in the driveway. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the shabby little bungalow. It still looked rough around the edges with its peeling paint and overgrown yard. But now it was hers. After 12 years of saving and sacrificing, after countless doubts and setbacks, she had done it. She had bought a home. As she unlocked the front door and stepped inside, she had no idea that this humble purchase was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. The first night in her new house, Jessica slept on an air mattress in the middle of the empty living room. The streetlight outside cast strange shadows on the walls, and every creak and groan of the old house settling made her eyes pop open. But even with the stained carpet beneath her and the musty smell in the air, she felt a sense of peace she had never experienced in any of her rental apartments. This was hers. Every creaky floorboard, every crack in the ceiling, every problem that needed fixing. All hers. She took the next day off work to start planning. Armed with a notebook and measuring tape, she walked through each room making lists. The kitchen needed new cabinet handles and a deep cleaning. The bathroom tiles were cracked and would need replacing eventually. The bedroom walls desperately needed fresh paint. As she wrote, the list grew longer and longer, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt energized. She had watched enough home improvement shows to know the basics, and YouTube would fill in the gaps for everything else. That first weekend, her friends came over to help. They spent Saturday pulling up the disgusting carpet in the living room, revealing hardwood floors underneath that were scratched and dull but structurally sound. On Sunday, they tackled the wallpaper, which came off in satisfying strips once they figured out the right technique. Her friend Mike, who worked in construction, showed her how to patch the holes in the walls and sand them smooth. By the end of the weekend, Jessica was exhausted, covered in dust, and happier than she had been in years. The weeks turned into months. Jessica fell into a rhythm. During the week, she taught her second-grade students, and in the evenings, she would come home and work on the house for a few hours before collapsing into bed. On weekends, she devoted entire days to bigger projects. She learned to use a power drill, how to caulk a bathtub, and the difference between flat and semi-gloss paint. Her hands developed calluses and her back ached constantly, but the house was slowly transforming. By September, 3 months after moving in, the main floor was starting to look livable. The walls were painted in soft, neutral colors. The hardwood floors had been refinished and gleamed in the sunlight. She had installed new light fixtures that made the rooms feel brighter and more modern. The kitchen still had the old appliances, but it was clean and functional. Jessica felt proud every time she walked through the front door. But there was one area she had been avoiding: the basement. She had only gone down there twice since buying the house, both times just to check that the water heater was working. The basement was dark and cluttered with stuff the estate sale company had either missed or deemed not worth their time. There were old boxes stacked haphazardly, broken furniture pushed against the walls, and years of accumulated junk that Mrs. Hartwell had apparently never thrown away. Jessica knew she needed to deal with it eventually, but it was such a depressing, overwhelming task that she kept putting it off. Finally, on a Saturday morning in late September, she decided it was time. She couldn't avoid it forever, and winter was coming. She needed to make sure the basement was in decent shape before the cold weather arrived. She pulled on old jeans and a t-shirt she didn't care about, grabbed a box of heavy-duty trash bags, and headed down the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was just as grim as she remembered. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows into the corners. The concrete floor was dusty, and cobwebs hung from the exposed ceiling joists. The smell of mildew was strong. Jessica sighed and got to work, starting with the obvious trash. Empty paint cans, old newspapers from the 1980s, broken picture frames, moth-eaten blankets. Bag after bag filled up with junk. As she worked her way across the basement, she came to a section against the far wall, where an old wooden bookshelf stood. It was one of those cheap particle board units that you could buy at any furniture store, and it was loaded with more boxes and random items. Jessica grabbed the top box and set it aside, planning to move the whole bookshelf so she could sweep behind it. But as she tried to pull the bookshelf forward, it wouldn't budge. At first she thought it might be attached to the wall somehow, but when she looked closer she realized the bottom was just wedged against something on the floor. She cleared away some of the debris and tried again, this time managing to shift it a few inches. That's when she noticed something odd about the wall behind it. The basement walls were bare concrete, gray and rough. But behind where the bookshelf had been standing, there was a section that looked different. It was smoother, and there appeared to be a faint rectangular outline like a seam. Jessica leaned in closer, running her hand along the surface. The concrete felt different here too, colder somehow, and definitely smoother. Her heart started beating faster. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it along the outline. It was definitely a seam, about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, forming a perfect rectangle. And there, along one edge, she could see what looked like tiny hinges, painted over so many times they were barely visible. It was a door. A small door built into the concrete wall and painted over to blend in. Jessica stood there for a moment, her mind racing. Why would someone build a door into a basement wall and then paint over it? What could possibly be behind it? Her imagination ran wild with possibilities. Maybe it was just access to some pipes or electrical work, or maybe it was a coal chute from when the house was first built. But if it was something that ordinary, why paint over it so deliberately? She needed to open it. She had to know what was behind there. But the door was sealed shut with layers and layers of paint. Jessica ran upstairs and grabbed a screwdriver and a utility knife from her toolbox. Back in the basement, she started carefully scraping away at the paint along the seam, working slowly so she wouldn't damage whatever was underneath. The paint came off in chips and flakes, decades of layers revealing themselves one at a time. After about 30 minutes of scraping, she had cleared most of the seam. She could see the hinges more clearly now, old and rusty but still intact. There was no visible handle or lock, just a small indentation where she could fit her fingers. Jessica wedged the screwdriver into the gap and gently pried. Nothing happened. She tried again, putting more force behind it. Still nothing. Frustrated, she went back upstairs and found a putty knife and a hammer. She carefully tapped the putty knife into the seam, working her way around the entire rectangle, breaking the paint seal. Then she tried the screwdriver again. This time she felt something give. A tiny bit of movement. Her hands were shaking now, partly from effort and partly from excitement. She repositioned herself, got a better grip, and pulled harder. Suddenly, with a sound like tearing paper, the door shifted. Paint cracked and fell away in chunks. Jessica pulled again, and the door swung open on its rusty hinges, revealing a dark space beyond. The opening was small, barely big enough for a person to crawl through if they wanted to. Jessica grabbed her phone and shined the flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light revealed what looked like a small room or compartment, maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, built right into the foundation of the house, and it wasn't empty. Inside, stacked neatly against the walls, were wooden crates and metal boxes. Lots of them, at least 20 or 30, maybe more in the shadows she couldn't quite see. They looked old but surprisingly well preserved, protected from the damp basement air by the sealed door. Jessica's mouth went dry. Her mind was spinning with questions. What was in those boxes? Why had they been hidden? How long had they been there? And most importantly, did Mrs. Hartwell know about this, or had it been sealed up so long ago that even she had forgotten? There was only one way to find out. Jessica took a deep breath, got down on her hands and knees, and crawled through the small door into the hidden room, her phone's flashlight beam dancing across the mysterious containers that had been waiting in the darkness for who knows how long. The hidden room smelled different from the rest of the basement. Drier somehow, despite being sealed up for what must have been decades. Jessica's phone flashlight swept across the space, illuminating dust particles floating in the air. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She sat back on her heels and just stared at the boxes for a moment, trying to process what she was seeing. The wooden crates looked old, really old, with metal corners and latches that had tarnished with age. The metal boxes were military-style containers, olive green and stamped with numbers and letters she didn't recognize. Everything was organized neatly, almost methodically, like someone had taken great care in storing these items. Whoever had hidden this stuff hadn't just tossed it in here and forgotten about it. This was deliberate. Planned. Jessica reached for the nearest box, a smaller metal one sitting on top of a larger crate. Her hands were trembling as she flipped open the rusty latches. They resisted at first, but with a little pressure they snapped open. She lifted the lid slowly, half expecting something to jump out at her. Instead, she found herself looking at stacks of what appeared to be comic books, each one wrapped carefully in clear plastic. She picked up the first one with shaking hands. Even through the plastic, she could see it was old. The colors on the cover were faded but still vibrant enough to make out the image. A man in a red and blue costume flying through the air. The title at the top read Action Comics, and there was a number in the corner. Number 7. The date said 1938. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't a comic book expert by any means, but even she knew that comic books from the 1930s were rare. Really rare. She carefully set it down and picked up another one. This one featured a dark figure with pointed ears and a cape, Batman from 1940. Then another, Captain America, 1941. Her mind was racing. These couldn't be real, could they? Original comic books from the golden age of comics just sitting in her basement. She set the comics aside carefully and reached for another box. This one was wooden, about the size of a shoebox. When she opened it, she found old coins nestled in individual slots in what looked like a collector's album. She didn't know much about coins either, but she could see dates: 1889, 1893, 1901. Silver dollars that gleamed even in the dim light of her phone. Jessica sat back and took a deep breath. This was insane. Absolutely insane. She looked around the small room with new eyes. How many boxes were in here? She started counting. 12 metal boxes of various sizes, 8 wooden crates, a few smaller containers stacked in the corner. Each one potentially filled with treasures like what she had just found. She knew she should probably stop and call someone, but she couldn't help herself. She reached for another crate, this one larger and heavier. The lid was nailed shut, but the nails were old and rusty. She crawled back out to the main basement and found a crowbar in her toolbox. Back in the hidden room, she carefully pried the lid open, the wood creaking in protest. Inside were toys. Vintage toys still in their original packaging. Her eyes went wide as she recognized some of them from pictures she had seen online. Star Wars action figures from the late 1970s, still sealed in plastic bubbles on cardboard backing. She saw Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, all pristine like they had been bought yesterday and frozen in time. Below those were Barbie dolls in boxes, but not modern ones. These were from the 1960s, with that distinctive vintage styling and perfect blonde hair visible through the plastic windows. Jessica's hands were shaking so badly now that she had to set down her phone to steady herself. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. They happened in movies or in stories you read online that probably weren't even true. But here she was, sitting in a hidden room in her basement, surrounded by what looked like a fortune in collectibles. She forced herself to slow down and think logically. She needed to document this. With trembling fingers, she started taking photos with her phone. Pictures of the room, pictures of each box, pictures of individual items. The flash on her phone seemed too bright in the dark space, making everything look surreal and dreamlike. After taking what must have been 100 photos, she continued her exploration. Another metal box contained jewelry wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. She unwrapped one piece and found a bracelet with deep blue stones that caught the light beautifully. Art Deco style, if she had to guess, from the 1920s or 1930s. There were necklaces, rings, brooches, all carefully wrapped and preserved. Some pieces had small tags attached with faded handwriting describing them, but the ink was too faded to read clearly. The next crate she opened made her gasp out loud. Vinyl records. Hundreds of them, it seemed, packed carefully in paper sleeves. She pulled out a few and examined them in the phone light. Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry. But these weren't just regular records. Some of them had signatures scrawled across the labels in permanent marker. To Jimmy, thanks for being a great fan. Elvis Presley. Another one was signed by all 4 members of the Beatles. Jessica set the records down carefully and just sat there for a moment, overwhelmed. Her mind was trying to calculate what all of this might be worth, but she had no idea. Thousands of dollars? Tens of thousands? More? She thought about her modest teacher's salary, about the 12 years she had spent saving every penny to buy this house, about how she had agonized over spending an extra $20 on anything. And now this. She crawled back out into the main basement and just stood there looking at the small door in the wall that had been hidden behind that cheap bookshelf. How long had this stuff been here? Who had put it here and why? Mrs. Hartwell had lived in this house for over 50 years. Had she known about this room? Had she forgotten? Or had it been sealed up before she even moved in? Jessica pulled out her phone and looked at the time. It was almost 3 in the afternoon. She had been down here for over 4 hours, so absorbed in her discovery that she had completely lost track of time. Her knees hurt from crawling around on the concrete floor, and she was covered in dust and grime, but she felt more alive than she had in years. She knew she couldn't tell just anyone about this. Word would spread, and who knows what kind of people might come around asking questions or worse. She needed to be smart about this, careful. She thought about her friend Rachel, who worked at an auction house downtown. Rachel knew about antiques and collectibles. She would know what to do, and more importantly, Jessica trusted her to keep quiet about it. But first, she needed to secure this room. Jessica went upstairs and found some old padlocks in the garage that the previous owner had left behind. She spent the next hour carefully moving all the boxes and crates out of the hidden room and into her bedroom upstairs, making multiple trips up and down the basement stairs. Her back was screaming in protest, but she didn't care. She needed these items somewhere safe while she figured out her next move. By the time she finished, her entire bedroom floor was covered with boxes and crates. She locked her bedroom door even though she lived alone and just stood there looking at the collection spread out before her. The afternoon sun streaming through her window made the dust particles dance in the air. And for a surreal moment, the whole scene looked like something out of a treasure hunter's dream. Jessica grabbed her phone and scrolled to Rachel's number. Her finger hovered over the call button for a moment. Once she made this call, everything would change. There would be no going back to her normal, simple life. But then again, that life had already changed the moment she pried open that hidden door. She pressed the call button and waited, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and fear about what would come next. Rachel picked up on the 3rd ring, sounding cheerful and relaxed. It was Saturday afternoon and Jessica could hear music playing in the background. Before Rachel could even finish saying hello, Jessica blurted out, "I need you to come over right now, and you have to promise not to tell anyone what I'm about to show you." There was a pause on the other end. Then Rachel's voice came back, concerned now. "Jess, are you okay? What's going on?" Jessica realized how frantic she must sound. She took a breath and tried to calm down. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. But I found something in my house and I need your professional opinion. Can you come over, please?" 30 minutes later, Rachel was standing in Jessica's bedroom, her mouth hanging open, staring at the boxes and crates scattered across the floor. She had walked into the room expecting maybe some old furniture or vintage dishes. What she was looking at now was something else entirely. "Where did you find all of this?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was already kneeling down next to the box of comic books, her trained eye scanning the covers without touching them yet. Jessica told her the whole story. The basement, the hidden door, the sealed room. As she talked, Rachel picked up items carefully, examining them with the kind of focus Jessica had seen her use at the auction house. When Jessica finished, Rachel sat back on her heels and looked up at her friend with an expression Jessica couldn't quite read. "Do you understand what you might have here?" Rachel asked quietly. I know it's old stuff and old stuff can be valuable, but I have no idea what any of it is actually worth," Jessica admitted. Rachel picked up the Action Comics issue again, holding it like it was made of glass. "Jessica, If this is authentic, and I mean if this is a genuine 1938 Action Comics, you could be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars. Just for this one comic book. Jessica felt the room tilt slightly. She sat down on her bed before her legs could give out. That can't be right. I'm not saying it is right. I'm saying it could be. But we need experts to verify everything. Real experts, not just me. Rachel was already pulling out her phone. I know people who specialize in this stuff. Comic book authenticators, coin experts, vintage toy collectors. We need to bring them in, but Jessica, you have to be careful about who you trust. Word gets out about something like this and you'll have people coming out of the woodwork. The next few days were a blur. Rachel made calls to people she trusted, speaking in vague terms about a potential estate find. She set up appointments but didn't give anyone Jessica's address until the day they were scheduled to come. Jessica took time off work, telling her principal she had a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. This felt like an emergency. The first expert who came was a man named David Chen, who specialized in vintage comic books. He was in his 60s with glasses that kept sliding down his nose, and he carried a large metal briefcase filled with equipment. He spent 3 hours in Jessica's living room, examining each comic book with tools Jessica didn't even know existed. Magnifying glasses, UV lights, some kind of device that measured paper thickness. He was quiet while he worked, occasionally making small humming sounds that gave away nothing about what he was thinking. Jessica sat on the couch fidgeting with her hands while Rachel stood nearby watching the process. The silence was torture. Finally, David looked up. He removed his glasses and cleaned them with a small cloth, taking his time. "Well," he said slowly, "I need to be honest with you. When Rachel called me, I was skeptical. You hear stories like this all the time, and 99% of them turn out to be reproductions or damaged copies worth very little." Jessica's heart sank. Here it comes, she thought. The disappointment. The reality check. But then David smiled. This is the 1%. These are authentic. The Action Comics issue alone, in this condition, could fetch anywhere from $350,000 to $450,000 at auction. And you have 17 other Golden Age comics here, all in remarkable condition. We're talking about a collection worth close to $500,000, possibly more. Jessica couldn't speak. She just stared at him, trying to process the numbers he was saying. Rachel squeezed her shoulder, and that small gesture brought her back to reality. Over the next 2 weeks, other experts came through. A coin specialist named Patricia examined the coin collection for an entire afternoon, using similar equipment and the same methodical approach. She determined that several of the silver dollars were rare mint editions, and there were also some gold coins Jessica hadn't even noticed in her initial discovery. The total value of the coin collection, Patricia estimated, was somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. Then came Robert, a vintage toy expert who actually got emotional when he saw the Star Wars figures. "Mint condition," he kept saying, shaking his head in disbelief. Absolutely mint condition. He spent hours cataloging each toy, taking photos, making notes. The toys, he estimated, were worth around $150,000, maybe more to the right collector. The jewelry was examined by a woman named Claire who specialized in estate jewelry and antiques. She brought a jeweler's loupe and spent a long time studying each piece. Some of the stones, she explained, were genuine precious gems. The Art Deco pieces were particularly valuable because of their craftsmanship and the era they came from. Claire's estimate for the jewelry collection was $220,000. Finally, a music memorabilia expert named Tom came to look at the vinyl records. He was younger than the other experts, maybe in his early 40s, and when he saw the signed albums, he actually laughed in disbelief. "Do you know how rare it is to find signed Beatles albums in this condition?" he asked. "Or a signed Elvis record with clear provenance?" The vinyl collection, he said, was worth at least $125,000. Possibly more if they could verify the signatures beyond any doubt. Each evening after the experts left, Jessica would sit alone in her house trying to wrap her mind around what she was being told. The numbers were staggering. When she added them up, the total came to somewhere between $1 and $1.3 million. It was more money than she had ever imagined having in her entire life. But with the excitement came anxiety. She barely slept during those weeks. Every sound the house made at night startled her awake. She had installed additional locks on all her doors and windows. She hadn't told anyone except Rachel and the experts. But she felt paranoid anyway, like somehow people knew what she had found. The experts all recommended the same thing. She should work with a reputable auction house to sell the collection. They could handle the marketing, attract serious buyers, and ensure she got fair market value for everything. They also strongly suggested she contact a lawyer to make sure everything was handled properly from a legal standpoint. That's when things got complicated. Jessica reached out to a lawyer, and the lawyer had questions. Important questions, like who did this collection actually belong to? The house had been sold to Jessica as is, and the collection hadn't been mentioned in any estate documents. But did that automatically make it hers? What about Mrs. Hartwell's nephews? Did they have any claim to it? The lawyer explained that he would need to research the matter thoroughly. He would need to look at the estate documents, the sales agreement, and local laws regarding found property. It could take time. In the meantime, he advised Jessica not to sell anything or make any public announcements about what she had found. So Jessica waited. The boxes and crates were now stored in a secure facility that Rachel had recommended, where they were climate-controlled and monitored by security cameras 24/7. Jessica had insurance on the collection now, which cost more per month than her old rent used to be. Her simple life had become decidedly less simple. 3 weeks after finding the hidden room, Jessica's lawyer called her with news. He had gone through all the documentation and consulted with other attorneys who specialized in estate law. The conclusion was clear. The collection had not been listed in Mrs. Hartwell's estate inventory. The house had been sold as is, with all contents included. And most importantly, the nephews had signed documents stating they had removed all items of value and that anything remaining in the house became the property of the buyer. "It's yours," the lawyer told her, "legally and completely. You own this collection." Jessica sat down slowly, the phone still pressed to her ear. After all the uncertainty, all the worry, it was really hers. The treasures that had been hidden in her basement for decades now belonged to her, an elementary school teacher who had saved for 12 years just to afford a rundown house. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the weight of what came next. Now she had to decide what to do with it all. The news that the collection was legally hers should have brought Jessica pure joy. Instead, she found herself lying awake at night with a different kind of worry. She kept thinking about Mrs. Hartwell, the elderly woman who had lived in this house for over 50 years. Had she known about the hidden room? Had she forgotten about it as the years passed? And what about the person who had originally collected all those items? What was their story? Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to understand the history behind what she had found. It felt important somehow, like she owed it to whoever had carefully wrapped those comics and coins and preserved them so meticulously. So she started digging into the past. She began at the county records office, pulling up old property deeds and documents. She learned that Mrs. Hartwell and her husband James had bought the house in 1967. Before that, the house had belonged to James's parents. James himself had passed away in 1967, the same year they purchased the house. That was odd. Why buy a house the same year your husband died? With more research, Jessica pieced together a story. James Hartwell had been a traveling salesman in the 1940s and 1950s, working for various companies up and down the West Coast. He had been on the road constantly, staying in different towns, meeting different people. And according to old newspaper clippings Jessica found at the library, he had been known as quite a character. Someone who loved collecting things. Someone who had an eye for items that might become valuable someday. James had died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 48, while on a business trip. He never got to retire, never got to enjoy his collection. And apparently, he had never told his wife Eleanor exactly where he had hidden his most prized possessions. Eleanor had sold their old house and moved into this smaller one, perhaps never knowing that the collection was here, sealed behind that wall in the basement. Or maybe she had known once but forgot as the decades passed and her memory faded. Understanding the story made Jessica's discovery feel different. This wasn't just a lucky break or a windfall. This was someone's life work. James Hartwell had spent years hunting for these items, carefully preserving them, dreaming of what they might be worth someday. And then he had died, and his dream died with him. Until now, Jessica made a decision. She would sell the collection, but she would do it thoughtfully. She would honor the memory of the man who had put it together. Working with the auction house Rachel had recommended, Jessica began the process of bringing the collection to market. The auction house was thrilled. They planned a special event, spreading the word through collector networks and vintage enthusiast communities. The response was overwhelming. People from all over the country, some from other countries, expressed interest in bidding. The auction took place on a Saturday in January, almost 7 months after Jessica had pried open that hidden door. She attended in person, sitting in the back of the auction house trying to remain anonymous. Her hands were sweating as the bidding began. She watched as strangers raised paddles and called out numbers that made her head spin. The Action Comics issue went for $410,000. A set of the Star Wars figures went for $95,000. The signed Beatles album sold for $48,000. By the end of the day, the final total was $1.2 million after the auction house took their commission. Jessica sat in her car in the parking lot afterward, just staring at the check they had given her. It didn't feel real. The numbers looked fake, like someone had made a joke check for a game show, but the money was real, very real. And now Jessica had to figure out what to do with it. Her first instinct was to quit teaching and never work again. She could travel the world, buy a new car, move to a bigger house, but as she thought about it more, she realized that wasn't what she wanted. She loved teaching. She loved her students, and the house, run down as it had been when she bought it, had become her home. She had put her own sweat and effort into fixing it up. Why would she leave? Instead, Jessica made a plan. A thoughtful plan that felt right. First, she paid off her mortgage completely. The house was hers, free and clear. That alone felt like the biggest weight lifted off her shoulders. No more monthly payments. No more anxiety about making ends meet. Then she fully renovated the house, doing everything she had been putting off because of the cost. New kitchen appliances, a completely redone bathroom, new windows that actually kept the cold out, a new roof. She hired professionals this time instead of doing everything herself, and within 3 months her modest little bungalow was transformed into a beautiful, comfortable home. She set aside $300,000 in a trust fund for her future. Maybe for kids someday, or maybe just for her own retirement. Either way, it was there, secure and growing. She bought a reliable new car, nothing fancy, just something that wouldn't break down every other month. And yes, she took a vacation to Europe, something she had always dreamed about but never thought she could afford. She spent 2 weeks in Italy, eating amazing food and seeing incredible art, and it was wonderful. But the most important thing Jessica did with the money was create a scholarship fund. She set up an endowment in Eleanor and James Hartwell's name, specifically for students from low-income families who wanted to become teachers. The scholarship would cover tuition, books, and living expenses for 2 students every year, in perpetuity. The fund was large enough that it would continue long after Jessica was gone. When Jessica told the nephews about the discovery and what she had done with part of the money, they were surprised, but gracious. They hadn't known about the collection, and legally it wasn't theirs, but Jessica felt it was right to let them know. She didn't offer them money, and they didn't ask for any. Instead, they thanked her for honoring their aunt and uncle's memory with the scholarship. The local newspaper eventually got wind of the story, though Jessica tried to keep the details private. The headline read, "Teacher's Home Renovation Uncovers Hidden Treasure." The article was small, just a few paragraphs, but it captured the essence of what had happened. A modest home purchase, a hidden room, a life-changing discovery. Jessica did one interview and then politely declined all others. She didn't want to be famous. She just wanted to live her life. A year after finding the collection, Jessica stood in her backyard on a sunny afternoon, sipping lemonade and looking at her house. The paint was fresh. The yard was neat and filled with flowers she had planted. Solar panels on the roof powered her home. It looked nothing like the rundown bungalow she had bought for $180,000. But more than the physical changes, Jessica herself had changed. She had learned that sometimes taking a chance on something that seems impossible can lead to extraordinary things. She had learned that beneath the surface of ordinary life, there can be hidden treasures waiting to be discovered. And most importantly, she had learned that what you do with good fortune matters more than the fortune itself. She still taught 2nd grade. She still brought her lunch to work in a lunchbox. She still lived modestly, even though she didn't have to anymore. But now she did it by choice, not necessity, and that made all the difference. Every time she went down to her basement, which was now clean and organized and turned into a proper workshop, She would glance at the wall where the hidden door had been. She had left it visible, not sealing it back up. It was a reminder of how her life had changed with one curious discovery on a Saturday afternoon when she had decided to finally tackle the mess in her basement. Sometimes her students would ask her what her house was like, and she would smile and tell them it was just a regular house in a quiet neighborhood, which was true. But she would also tell them that every house has stories hidden in its walls, and sometimes those stories can surprise you in the most amazing ways. Jessica had bought that house hoping for stability and a place to call her own. What she got was so much more than that. She got a mystery solved, a fortune found, and a chance to honor the memory of strangers who had come before her. She got to help students follow their dreams just like she had followed hers. And every single night when she locked her front door and turned off the lights, she felt grateful. Not just for the money, though that was wonderful, but grateful for the journey. For the adventure of renovation that led to discovery. For the reminder that life can surprise you when you least expect it. Her modest home purchase had indeed turned into $1 million discovery. But the real treasure, Jessica realized, wasn't in the boxes and crates she had found. It was in what she had learned about herself, about taking chances, and about the importance of honoring the past while building the future. And that was worth more than any amount of money could ever buy.